What a great thrill it is for me to be here at the University of Houston Honors College. I did make it to the top, and to find that it's led as the dean by my longtime friend Bill Monroe, who I've known since I was in the first grade. And what really ticks me off is I'm 2 years younger than Bill, and he looks at least 5 years younger than I. So I don't know how you do it, Bill. Clean living, I guess. But anyway, as Bill mentioned, we had dinner last night. He told me about this honors college. He told me about how much he loves his job because all the students are such hard workers and not only work hard and have high aspirations, but you all have great hearts. You're whole soul people, and that's the best kind of people. So kudos to you for being a part of this wonderful program. And so for all of you high achievers here in the Honors College, my opening word of wisdom for you is there's nothing more important for your future than to develop your word power as much as you can. That's my grand challenge. This is the grand challenge forum. My grand challenge to you today is to listen to these points when we're finished. I'm going to have a little card that'll be handed out so you don't even have to take notes. It's on the card. But I hope that these will give you some good ideas about how to develop your word power, whether you're speaking or whether you're writing. And if you do, and keep on going with that, keep on growing with that, then watch the rest of your life take off. So over 2 centuries ago, Ben Franklin said, "Nothing is certain except death and taxes." Well, today, I think we can take Ben's thoughts and keep on going and add one more. And that is the certainty that the world, but particularly the United States and Europe, are going to always have a timeless admiration for Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill. And it's going to stay alive decade after decade, not only because of what they did to save their countries during their darkest hours, but because of what they said and how they said it to maximize their word power. How did Lincoln and Churchill know that their words would grow their historical legacies? Well, Churchill's answer to that question was, "Words are the only things that last forever. The most tremendous monuments or prodigies of engineering crumble under the hands of time." As you'll soon hear, Lincoln and Churchill had similar thoughts on best practices in communication. And that's not surprising, since the lives of Lincoln, the greatest statesman of the 19th century, and Churchill, the greatest statesman of the 20th century, had much in common. Per Lewis Lehrman's recent book, Lincoln and Churchill, Statesmen at War, and on his website, lincolnandchurchill.org. Now, among the life parallels that shaped the two men's shared thoughts on word power, both at a very young age had high ambition, and they knew that in order to reach the top, they were going to have to be able to speak the part. Second, they both had sponge-like memories, so they could remember poems, scripture, history lessons, which they plugged into their conversations and their speeches with perfect timing. Next, they both had jobs that demanded word power before they became leaders, Lincoln as a trial lawyer and Churchill as a historian. Next, both ran for political office throughout their entire adult lives, meaning they spoke constantly to crowds. And for people as smart as they were, practice made perfect. And last but not least, both led their nations in devastating wars by persevering through major setbacks, which gave their words greater weight than those that came from non-leaders or that came from leaders during less challenging times. So with all these important interwoven factors that empowered Lincoln and Churchill to create their word masterpieces, by the end of my speech, may you have a better grasp of how they achieved their word power so you can apply their practices and improve your word power. So with that introduction, let's start with Lincoln. What were Father Abraham's most important communication tools that worked so well for him that can work well for us today? Well, he had 6 of them in his toolkit, and that assessment came from Jacques Berzon, now deceased, but the longtime dean at Columbia University, who wrote an essay that appeared in the February 1959 issue of the Saturday Evening Post entitled "Lincoln, the Literary Genius," to commemorate the 150th birthday of Lincoln. And so, in developing these 6 points that made Lincoln the literary genius, let's take them one by one. First tool, Lincoln was obsessed with precision in his choice of words. What was it that made him so good at precision? Well, I'm sure most, if not all of you, are aware that for 23 years before he became president, Lincoln was a top-flight trial and appellate lawyer in Illinois. And Jacques Barzon, in explaining Lincoln's genius, said, "A part of his extraordinary skill in demonstrating and communicating came from the practice of legal thought, because the language of the law foresees doubt, ambiguity, confusion, error, and one by one, it removes them. The great compression of Lincoln's language came after he had, lawyer-like, removed all unsatisfactory wording alternatives and hit upon just the right order and emphasis." So Barzon's assessment of Lincoln's precision can be put into 8 simple words. Say exactly what you mean. Eliminate needless words. And that went straight into Strunk and White, and their first edition of their book came out 50 years after Lincoln's death. So whoever wants to have precision in your choice of words should take these 8 words to heart. Say exactly what you mean. Eliminate needless words. Now, why is precision in word choice so important? Short answer, because it produces clarity. Fred Kaplan, a noted Lincoln biographer, wrote "The Biography of a Writer," gives this vivid description of how clear Lincoln's communications were. His words were like a perfectly focused camera image, like looking through 100 feet of clear water marked by transparent honesty. Lincoln's insistence on precise word choice was also recognized by Douglas Wilson, another Lincoln biographer, who proved it by describing Lincoln's response to someone's ill-advised attempt to edit one of his speeches. Here's what Lincoln told the editor in rejecting his edits. Quote, "I do not wish this sense changed or modified to a hair's breadth. You, Mr. Editor, not having studied the points as closely as I, cannot be quite sure that you do not change the sense when you don't intend it. For instance, on the first page, you propose to substitute the word Democrats for Douglas. What I'm saying here is true of Douglas, but it's not true of Democrats generally. Thus, your proposed substitution would be a considerable blunder." Here Lincoln was making the point, when I give a speech, I want every word to mean exactly what I want it to mean. Lincoln then went on with the editor. "On page 5, your proposed insertion of the word residences, though it would do little or no harm, is not at all necessary to the sense that I'm trying to convey." Here Lincoln was saying, in my speeches, there will not be one unnecessary word. Now here's an example of Lincoln's giving maximum information with minimum words to produce clarity. And it was in his opening statement of a jury trial. Quote, "Turn then to that horror-striking scene at St. Louis. Only a single victim was sacrificed there. His story is short and may be the most highly tragic of anything of its length that has ever been witnessed in real life. A mulatto man named McIntosh was seized in a city street, dragged to the suburbs, chained to a tree, and actually burned to death. and all within a single hour from the time he had been a free man, attending to his own business and at peace with the world. Now, how's that for precision and clarity? A complete life and death true story in 4 tight sentences. Second tool, have an acute sense of audience. By knowing who his listeners were or who his readers were, Lincoln would speak their language, which allowed his words to be better understood, to carry more empathy, and put him in a better position to touch their hearts. And once he touched their hearts, then he could change their minds. He knew, and all of us need to know, that you cannot change anyone's mind until you touch their heart. Now, here are 2 examples of Lincoln's using different language with different audiences, which allowed him to maximize his message with each crowd. First audience, when Lincoln got in front of juries, who were then made up of mainly farmers and folks with little education, he used his down-home, common folk touch. He once told a young lawyer how to talk to a jury. Don't shoot too high. Shoot down low. Only then will the common people understand you. Harriet Beecher Stowe once said that when he needed to shoot down low and reach the farmers, Lincoln's words had, quote, the smack of soil. Another example of Lincoln's tailoring his words to a specific audience was his Emancipation Proclamation, a purely legal document that Lincoln knew when he issued it was likely to be presented to an audience of United States Supreme Court justices. Now, if you've ever read the proclamation, you know that its words have no eloquence. They're like boilerplate. They're like the documents you sign but don't read when you go in for surgery. They're just dry verbiage, but they were legally airtight to have the greatest chance of surviving Supreme Court scrutiny. Lincoln also purposefully made the proclamation's language dry because of another audience besides the Supreme Court, and that other group being those who lived in the border states during the Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves in the border states. It only freed the slaves in the Confederate States, and thus it contained no volatile words about the evil or immorality of slavery, because that surely would have aroused anger in the people in the border states. And Lincoln knew that he had to keep them if he wanted to win the Civil War. The words that Lincoln did choose to put into the Emancipation Proclamation to justify what he was doing were words that every northern and border state audience wanted to read, and they didn't need to be eloquent. That is, he said that as Commander-in-Chief, I'm freeing the slaves who escaped from the South to the North as a matter of military necessity, so that the freed slaves could join the Northern Army. And then once they did that, the size of the army would surge, and an enlarged Union Army would surely cause the horrific Civil War to end quicker. Third tool, never misrepresent or overstate anything. Honest Abe Lincoln was wired for truth. Here's what he told a group of young lawyers about how to practice law. Resolve to be honest at all events. And if your own judgment you can't be an honest lawyer, resolve to be honest without being a lawyer. But taking this honesty into the courtroom, in terms of everything that he said was trustworthy, in his jury trials, during his opening arguments, he would often say, look, if I falsify in this, what I'm saying in this opening statement, you can convict me. The witnesses live, and they can tell. He knew that speaking the truth is essential to credibility, and it's impossible to persuade anybody when the speaker lacks credibility. The fourth tool, when it was time to persuade, Lincoln spoke with an impassioned and earnest tone that flowed from the sincerity of his convictions. One of his colleagues observed that when Lincoln got thoroughly roused, he, quote, would come out with an earnestness of conviction, a power of argument, and a wealth of illustration that I have never seen surpassed. You saw Daniel Day-Lewis project Lincoln's earnest and impassioned tone, fueled by his deep convictions throughout the recent Spielberg film. Now, Lincoln's political hero was Henry Clay. And when Clay died in 1852, Lincoln gave a eulogy that identified the key to Clay's oratory power, but it also happened to be Lincoln's goal every time it was his turn to persuade. Mr. Clay's eloquence did not consist in elegant arrangements of words and sentences, but rather of that deeply earnest and impassioned tone which can proceed only from great sincerity and the speaker's thorough conviction in the justice and importance of his cause. This is what truly touches the chords of human sympathy. Note, however, that earnest, impassioned tone is something different from an emotional outpouring. Barzun pointed out Lincoln never seemed to have considered it within his power to convince by disturbing others' judgment using his emotions. Fifth tool, build rapport with your audience using wit or humor, though use it with calculated restraint. Here's an example of Lincoln's wry wit in the courtroom. It was in a closing argument where the main witness for the other side had been especially long-winded. And so when it came time for Lincoln to give his thoughts on this long-winded witness to the jury, here's what he said. He said, you know, that witness reminds me of a lazy preacher that I once knew, but he often gave very long sermons. And so someone asked a deacon at the church why a man who was so lazy would write such long sermons. And the deacon answered, oh, he gets to writing and he's too lazy to stop. So with that kind of gentle humor, Lincoln could destroy an opposing witness. Yes, every audience likes a speaker who can make them smile from time to time, but Lincoln didn't use his humor constantly because he knew he'd lose his power as a persuader if his audience thought he was trying too hard or too often to be a comedian. Sixth and final tool, and it's a skill too few people recognize today, and I say this especially to you students. You're all wired up for high technology, everything's moving faster, and almost every young person I meet today speaks entirely too fast. Barzun identified this last skill of using rhythmic, deliberate cadence when he encouraged those who were reading Lincoln's speeches, his editorials, or his letters to let Lincoln's choice of words, the rhythm and shape of his utterances, linger in the ear. When you do that, you begin to feel as he did. His extraordinary power was to make his spirit felt. Now, many of the people my age in the room, and maybe some of you young people, are fans of David McCullough, two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. David McCullough, whenever he's writing a book and comes to the end of each chapter, sits down with his wife, Rosalie, and has her read the chapter aloud to him so that he can hear the rhythm of the words and satisfy himself that they work. Puts himself in the reader's position, and that's his process. And for a speaker to have rhythm requires him to deliver his message in spurts. Sometimes slow, sometimes fast, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, and to pause at the right time to emphasize his points. So, here's an example of Lincoln's using the power of slow, rhythmic, repetitive words at the end of his Gettysburg Address. This nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Now, how's that for rhythm that makes language resonate, reverberate, and penetrate? Here's more rhythmic prose that even rhymes from Lincoln's second inaugural address. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. In those 4 short lines, clear, pleasing to the ear, Lincoln captured what was front and center on the mind of everybody in that Inauguration Day crowd on that day that turned out to be a month before the Civil War ended. So there you have it, Lincoln's 6 tools for effective communication: word precision, acute sense of audience, refusal to misrepresent or overstate, earnest but not emotional tone, calculated but not overdone wit, and rhythmic, deliberate cadence. Use all 6 and watch how they enhance your word power. Now let's move on to Winston Churchill. As I said earlier, Churchill was not only a great political leader, but he was also a leading historian of his era, winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, who authored dozens of books, including the series A History of the English-Speaking Peoples. Now, he titled the 4th and final volume in that series, The Great Democracies, and it covered the time period from 1815 to 1902, which meant a large portion of it was devoted to the American Civil War. And in those pages, Churchill portrayed Lincoln as the world's greatest hero of those 87 years. Why was Lincoln such a hero to Churchill? Well, there were several reasons, but a main one was Churchill said Lincoln, quote, unfolded in magnificent orations, calm, massive, and magnanimous, the anti-slavery cause. And his orations elevated Lincoln's leadership throughout the Civil War, which Churchill called, quote, the noblest and least avoidable of all the great mass conflicts of which till then there was record. In researching the book, Churchill researched the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the transcripts of them, Lincoln's greatest speeches, and he then worked what Lincoln's approach was into Churchill's own personal style. And what worked so well for Lincoln also obviously worked well for Churchill. Now, though there have been hundreds of biographies written about Churchill, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal agreed that the best of all of them came out in November 2018, written by British historian Andrew Roberts, entitled Churchill, Walking with Destiny. And that book is my main source on Churchill's word power. Now, Churchill established himself as a bona fide communication prodigy at age 23 in an unpublished article he wrote that was titled The Scaffolding of Rhetoric. In the preface to his essay, Churchill wrote, of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is so precious as the gift of oratory. He who enjoys it wields a greater power than that of a great king. He is an independent force in the world. And his scaffolding of rhetoric had 5 parts, and as you'll see, they aligned with many of Lincoln's tools because he erected his scaffolding with full knowledge of and therefore use of Lincoln's tools. So scaffolding board number 1, be precise with your word choice and prefer short, old words. Churchill believed that an exact appreciation of words would ensure that the communicator would engage in the continued employment of the best possible word. Churchill's valet once explained to him, "Sir, you're sitting on your water bottle. That's not a good idea." To which Churchill calmly replied, "Idea? It isn't an idea. It's a coincidence. Thus, Sir Winston was a stickler for word precision even when it didn't matter. Now, in his choice for the best possible word, he favored short words of common usage to maximize clarity. And someone once complimented Churchill. He gave a speech in January 1940 on the high percentage of one-syllable words in his speech. Churchill responded, "Short words are best, and old words when best, and old words when short are best of all." In his wartime speeches, using that precept, he would typically use the word foe instead of enemy. And as following that preference for short, old words, in a speech that he gave during the London Blitz, he urged his people, quote, to look back hundreds of years to similar moments of national peril. And as he reviewed the events in British history, he used deliberately archaic language to remind Brits of their rich past, emphasizing each historic event's unique features with, "Pray explain how this happened," instead of "please explain how it happened." So scaffolding board number 2. Again, like Lincoln, craft rhythmic sentences. Churchill understood the importance of rhythm and word power the same way Lincoln did and the same way David McCullough does. Although he believed his chosen words should be short, he said sentences need not be short, provided they have an internal rhythm. Andrew Roberts said Churchill created rolling, sonorous sentences with phrases that produced a cadence resembling blank verse rather than prose, using the rhetorical device anaphora, which involves using the same words in rapid succession. He did this in his famous speech to the House of Commons in June 1940, that I'm sure you remember if you saw the movie The Darkest Hour, when in his climax, he ratcheted up his people's resolve to deal with the Nazi reign of terror with these words: "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Now, of the 75 words in this electrifying charge to his people, 66 of them had one syllable. Similarly, in Lincoln's second inaugural address, it contained 702 words. Over 500 were one syllable. Scaffolding board number 3, build arguments that gain momentum. Churchill said that the power to persuade comes with the steady accumulation of argument, bringing forward a series of facts that all point in a common direction. In his famous Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, in March of 1946, the speech was Churchill warning all the countries who had participated in winning World War II, obviously including the United States, a year before, to rethink their perception of their former ally, the Soviet Union. He explained what Stalin had been doing since the end of World War II in Italy, France, Germany, Poland, Turkey, Persia, and the Far East, country by country by country, building momentum to give the world a wake-up call about the looming communist expansion crisis that Stalin was engineering. Scaffolding board number 4, use analogies or metaphors to enhance and clarify. Now, a picture can be worth 1,000 words. In many cases, so can a great analogy or metaphor. When a speaker aligns two different images or circumstances and puts them together and it works, you can instantly translate an established truth into something clearer and more engaging. An example of Churchill showcasing his skill in this area came a month after the United States had entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, when someone suggested that Churchill should continue to use the very cautious language in dealing with the United States that he had been using before the U.S. joined the war effort. And Churchill's response was, "Oh, we talked cautiously to her while we were wooing her, but now that she's in the harem, we can talk to her quite differently." Scaffolding board number 5. Extravagance can elevate and motivate the masses. Churchill said that sometimes, to maximize the power of his words, wild extravagance of language should be used because it arouses feelings of both the speaker and the audience and can become the watchword of parties and the creeds of nationalities. Now, an example came in May 1939, while he watched in dismay as Chamberlain and Halifax failed to check Hitler and Mussolini's aggression in Eastern Europe. Churchill ramped up his description of the threat by becoming a forceful prophet of doom if Britain kept turning away from confronting the Nazis. Quote, "To submit to the Nazi encroachments would be to condemn a large portion of mankind to their rule, though to resist them either in peace or in war will be dangerous, painful, and hard. No one should go forward in this business without realizing plainly what the costs may be and what the issues are at stake." To symbolize his perception that loaded words can hit the mark, after the war ended, when people all over the world were praising Churchill's courage, they started calling him the last lion, the name of a very famous biography by William Manchester. Churchill said, "It was the nation and the race dwelling all around the world that had the lion heart. I was not the lion, but it fell to me to give the roar." Now, how to take Sir Winston's 5 boards of scaffolding and use them to build a word architectural masterpiece. Well, for Churchill, there were no shortcuts. First, to turn scaffolding into a final perfect structure came only after he had relentlessly edited multiple drafts and for his speeches rehearsed them repeatedly. And with each pass-through, his word choice just kept getting better and better and better. A journalist once visited Churchill's home on the day before a major speech, and all day long he heard Churchill booming away in his bedroom, rehearsing his facts and his flourishes to the accompaniment of resounding knocks on the furniture. His practicing for a speech was so intense and focused that he typically worked on it all through the night and into the next morning. Now, the second way that Churchill transformed scaffolding into architectural gems, again using Abraham Lincoln's tools. Andrew Roberts said Churchill's eloquence, clarity, and power of persuasion made their mark only because those who heard his dazzling words knew they could take the accuracy of their content to the bank. Churchill learned from his father, who had been a leader in the House of Commons, the importance of a statesman's delivering an honest message. His father's motto, "Trust the people." They can hear the worst kind of news, so long as it's not put in a demoralizing way. His honesty in speaking to the masses paid dividends. Andrew Roberts said his huge political capital in later years rested on the public perception that he told unpopular truths as he saw them. Now, as World War II raged on in line with Churchill's steadfast commitment to speaking the truth, British diplomat Harold Nicholson wrote of Churchill in his diary, "I must say that he does not try to cheer us up with vain promises." And his secretary, Leslie Bowen, said Churchill hated civil servants who had used polite but insincere remarks designed to please. The third and final way that Churchill turned scaffolding into a masterpiece, he always made sure his content had pizzazz in it that would heighten the audience's engagement. And every audience loves pizzazz. There's an old adage about public speaking that people my age all know. There's 3 main points to be a successful public speaker. Make it interesting, make it interesting, and make it interesting. You stick with that, you're going to be a great public speaker. And Churchill hit the mark by sprinkling humor, alliteration, scripture, Shakespeare, poetry, and history lessons throughout his speeches. His dazzling wordplay using all these methods produced the bells and whistles that allowed him to hold the audience in his hand from beginning to end. For humor, like Lincoln, Churchill knew what worked. And for one thing, people typically respond favorably to a speaker's self-deprecation. As an example of this, after World War II, universities all over the world wanted to give him honorary degrees. And at the ceremony where he received one at the University of Miami, he delighted the crowd by saying, "I am surprised that in my later life I should have become so experienced in taking degrees. When I was a schoolboy, I was so bad at passing examinations." Now, alliteration also gave Churchill's word pictures extra color. In a speech in July 1941, after the London Blitz, here's how he expressed his contempt for Hitler. "We will have no truce or parley with you or the grisly gang who work with your wicked will." Alliteration produces pizzazz. Knowing most Brits of his era were churchgoers, Churchill on occasion would integrate scripture into his remarks. In 1938, as he wrote of Hitler's rising threat and recognized that defeating the Nazis would require collaboration among a United States of Europe, Churchill used a passage from 2 Kings in the Old Testament to drive home that England's entering into a European alliance during wartime would not impact its independent position on the continent. "We are with Europe, but not of it. Should European statesmen address us in the words which were used of old, wouldst thou be spoken for to the king or the captain of the host, we should reply with the Shunammite woman, I dwell with my own people." Churchill's dazzling capacity to spice up his speeches to further audience engagement sprang from another trait that he shared with Lincoln, his memory. He remembered everything he ever heard or read. By the end of adolescence, he had memorized and could later work into his speeches many scenes from Shakespeare, as well as poetry from the likes of Byron, Tennyson, and Longfellow. In addition to using humor, alliteration, scripture, and poetry to make his speeches more interesting, as a leading historian, Churchill knew how to use England's past to inspire the folks living in the present. For example, during a radio broadcast in the midst of the London Blitz, he elevated his people by telling them they were going to have to be more heroic than their brave forefathers. Quote, "Today ranks with the days when the Spanish Armada was approaching the Channel and Drake was finishing his game of bowls, or when Nelson stood between us and Napoleon's grand army at Boulogne. What is happening now is on a far greater scale and of far more consequence to the life and future of the world than these brave old days of the past. Every man and woman must therefore prepare themselves to do their duty with special pride and care." So there you have it, University of Houston Honors College High Achievers, best practices in word power from Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill, the most powerful and enduring communicators of the last 200 years. Now, admittedly, none of us mere mortals has the horsepower to rise to their elite level of wordsmithing, but regardless of our limitations, while Lincoln and Churchill stand together at the top of Mount Eloquence, all in this audience, in this fine honors college, who aspire to enhance our word power today must keep on going and do everything we can to use the tools, the scaffolding, and the architectural skills that Father Abraham and Sir Winston used as an essential part of leading their countries. which thanks to history is preserved for all of us to admire and use, and continues to inspire our never-ending love affair with these two great men. Thank you very much.